Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you, whether it's morning or afternoon or evening, whenever you're listening to this. My name is Steve Hinson, and I'm a local resident here in the Andover, Ohio area in Ashtabula County. I happen to own some property right along the lake, Lake Pymatuning, which is what we're going to talk about. And that property is in a housing development. And about 8 years ago, we had a meeting of a committee, and they said, gee, we're coming up on the 75th year anniversary. We need to do something about talking about the property. And I said, well, who knows about the property? And it didn't seem like anyone knew anything at all about how the property got there and its relationship to the lake and those kinds of things. So being retired and not having a lot of things to do, I started investigating the background of Pymatuning Lake. Not so much the building of the lake, because there's a lot of information available on that, but really the whole story behind the lake and the area around the lake. So we're going to begin the story back about 35,000 years ago in the prehistory of the area. And during that period of time, the glaciers were covering most of the eastern part of the United States, at least down through the New York area into New Jersey and all the way west across the United States. And this was called the Wisconsin Ice Age. And if you were here in Andover at that point in time, of course Andover wasn't here, you would look up, and if you couldn't look up because you would be in ice, there would be about 1 mile to 1.5 miles of ice above you. So the ice was very, very thick during that period of time. Over time, the glaciers started to melt and they started to recede. And in this picture, you see a glacier, and in front of that glacier, you happen to see trees. And in front of those trees, you will also see two people standing on a walkway. Now, this glacier isn't, in fact, receding, but you can see that as that glacier recedes, it recedes over a long period of time, and trees begin to grow up. And so in the area, the Andover area, that's what happened as that glacier receded. The trees began to grow up. There were more and more trees. The trees died. They fell over, and over thousands and thousands of years, it created an area which was very swampy. Trees fell across streams, built up, they deteriorated. And so it wound up with being a lot of swamp area here in this area. So we'll kind of move on tens of thousands of years here, and we'll talk about the Beringer migration, and everyone relates to the Beringer migration as the period of time when people from the Asian continent came across to the northern part of what's now the United States and Canada. And that migration occurred over thousands of years. They came in to North America, they spread out going south to South America, they came across the America to the southeastern part of the United States before the United States. And they also came across the Canadian area to the east. And so the first people that we know of that were in this area were in fact the Mound Builders. Now we all relate to the Mound Builders in the southern part of Ohio, but at that point in time there were Mound Builders here, and in fact in the area where the lake's at, there were 3 mounds that were in that lake. Now of course in this day and age, if we were to run into one of those mounds out there, everything would stop, the work would stop, and the archaeologist would come in and they would start doing excavations and take a look in those mounds and see what was there and perhaps move any bodies that might happen to be there. But back when the lake was put in place in the 1930s, that was not the case. So, but there were 3 mounds that were in the lake. We kind of fast forward again in time to around the year 1000 to 1850. And at that point in time, we begin to see the Indians and the Indian names that we have become familiar with in our study of history. The Lenni Lenape, who were the Delaware, and the Seneca, who were the Iroquois Indians, were in this area during that period of time, all the way up to, and they were here until 1850, after the white man had come. The settlers in this area, in the Andover area, started appearing around 1802, 1803. Other parts of Ohio had been settled at that point in time. So in the 1860s, after the Civil War, there was a lot of interest in draining the swamp. It was an agricultural economy at that point in time, and farmers wanted to have more land to farm. Certainly the swampy area, once it was drained, would provide extremely good and fertile straw, extremely good and fertile land to be able to farm. And so the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which is where most of the swamp was at, put together a program and did a study to determine whether or not drainage would be possible. And they did confirm that. They came up with a plan of being able to drain the swamp. But as politics go of the time, there was no real interest in putting forth the money in order to be able to do that. So as a result, nothing was really done during the 1860s relative to draining the swamp. Industry arrived in the area in the late 1800s, mostly in the form of steel mills along the Shenandoah River and all of the other supporting companies that were coming in at that point in time. So the industry in the area began to grow. One of the issues that they ran into, most of these steel mills and companies were along the Shenandoah River, and they had to deal with a lot of flooding that came along, as well as drought. Back in that time period, we did not have the EPA, and they dumped their raw effluent into the Shenandoah River. And when the Shenandoah River dried up, it would smell, and the people in the area did not like the smells very well. And so those were the issues during that period of time. About 1907, there was PA legislation to do a study and to build a reservoir. Now this is the flip side of draining the swamp. And of course now we have a competition going on between the farmers in the area and the steel mills and companies down the Shenandoah River. So the industries were pushing for more water to keep those streams moving and to allow their affluent and everything to flow on down the river. And as a result of that study, there was a confirmation that, yeah, you can in fact build a dam and dam it back up and build a reservoir and control that water as it's going down. And so a decision was made then to build a dam. And we have some pictures here. The first picture is depicting a flood of 1913 of the Shenandoah River in Sharon, Pennsylvania. The water rose to a little bit above the first floor level, first story level in the buildings in Sharon, Pennsylvania. And there was over $3 million of damage. Now, it's quite a bit of damage back in that day and age, and there were certainly lives that were lost during that flood. And so the legislature got together, and this time they said, okay, we're going to approve some money. So they approved $1.2 million. The only problem is that by the time it got to the governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, that got cut to $100,000. So they really didn't have enough money to be able to move forward. So over the next ensuing years, there were additional floods that came, and finally in 1917, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania enacted additional legislation, putting forth $700,000. The only problem that they had was, as part of that reservoir, was going to be in Ohio. Now, how do you deal with that? You just can't go buy a section of Ohio and put your lake in. So they kind of hemmed and hawed for a few years. And of course, in 1917, we're now in the midst of World War I. And there are all of those issues with dealing with war, which were a lot more higher priority than determining whether we're going to put a lake in. In 1918, towards the end of the war, the steel companies along the Shenandoah River decided that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania really wasn't going to move forward with this lake because of the Ohio situation. And so they got together and they started purchasing land in 1919 in Ohio. They pooled all of their money together, and in 1919, they began purchasing the land in Ohio. We're going to get into that land in a little bit. And in 1920, they formed the Pymatuning Land Company. And the purpose of that Pymatuning Land Company then was to take care of all the issues associated with the paying of taxes on that land and those kinds of things that they were going to have to do until the lake got built. So we now have private ownership of the land in Ohio. So at this point in time, we're going to talk a little bit about the land itself and what happened with the land. In this picture, we have an overview of an area, which those of you who live in this area will be familiar with it. This is what is now we know as the Causeway that goes across the lake. This is Lake Road that comes down across Marvin and Slater and Gibbs Roads. And then it makes a left-hand turn, goes down to the Haynes Marina down there and the Duck and Drake down in this corner, and then it goes on down to Winfield. So that's sort of where you're at in this picture. And so back in 1919 and 1920, there's a lot of land that's going to be purchased. Now, the problem is, okay, what land are you going to purchase? Well, this is a contour map. Typical contour map. This is not exactly to scale, but it'll put forth the idea for you of what happened. They came in and they said, if we build a dam and it fills up with water in the reservoir, that water is going to fill up to about the 1,012 foot level. And so the Pymatuning Land Company came to Ohio and they asked the surveyor to do a survey of all of the land that was east of this road where the lake was going to be, so that they knew exactly where all the pinpoints and stakes were at, and to make sure that they knew where this 1,012 foot level was at. So I'm going to remove the other contour lines here and simplify our map a little bit. This is the 1,012 foot line. You see that there are some truncated pyramids over on this side. Literally at one point in time, there were big stone truncated pyramids that stood about 4 or 5 foot high all along the Ohio-Pennsylvania line. And so those were easy to find during that day and age because it was pretty much farmland and it was pretty much barren. So in the next slide, I put in some farmers here. We got farmers A, B, C, D, and so on down through there. I've kind of shaded in where the lake's going to be. And so now the Pymatuning Land Company needs to buy land along this 1,012 foot line. And they come in and survey and they put in straight lines so that the water, straight lines where the water will not be going past those straight lines, to kind of demark where they needed to buy land to. And in the next slide, we're going to start talking about the farmers who were selling their land. And this was Farmer A up here. And Farmer A decided, you know, he says, if you're going to buy this much or buy land, I don't have very much land left to farm. And so if you're going to buy it, you've got to buy it all. And so when the Pymatuning Land Company came in to buy that land, they bought all the land where the lake was at, and then they also bought the rest of that farmer's land, which they didn't really need, but then again, the farmer couldn't farm. So we'll go on down to the next couple of farmers, B and C, and as I've indicated here, they said, well, you know, we really still have plenty of land to farm. Maybe they had some other land in other places, and so we still have land to farm. We'll be happy to sell you this land here. So they sold land right along the edge of the lake, again on a straight line basis, coming down for the property line. And so as we come on down, you can see there were some farmers that sold, there were some farmers that didn't sell, and some farmers wound up having land along the lake. what happens ultimately with that land is the green that's shown here ultimately becomes a Pymatuning State Park after the lake has been built. And we'll get into that a little bit more later on. There are also some land that was right up against the lake. Those turned into allotments, what we call allotments here in Andover, which are housing developments, but they were primarily established for people who wanted to come out and spend the weekends and spend the summers out here. They were recreational property. If you can imagine the sale of recreational property back in the 1930s. So the green again becomes ultimately the state park, and there are also some businesses like the Haynes Marina down here and Bayshore, which is a campground, as well as the state park campgrounds. So that's kind of what happened to that land later on when the lake was finally put in. Now, to these farmers, they got some benefits with this land. The first thing was they were allowed to continue to farm that land, even though they had sold it, up until they were notified that they no longer could farm it. So remember, the sale of land occurred in 1919, 1920. They actually kept that land until about 1932 and farmed it, and have received the benefit of a payment for that land also. They also were not required to pay any taxes. The Pymatuning Land Company in the agreement said that they would pay the taxes on that land. So the farmer now gets his land, and he gets it tax-free for the period of time that he's going to be there. And so the last thing that the farmers got was the benefit of having access to the lake. And again, a little bit later on, we'll see in 1935 where there's an easement given to those farmers for them to have access to the lake. There were some interesting things in the deeds that went along with the sale of this property. There was one deed which gave the right to have a boathouse and a boat. Now, this was long before the lake. The owner knew what was going to happen with the property. It was going to go into that. So he owned that property down near the lake. He wanted the right to be able to have a boathouse and a boat down there. We know this today as Haynes Marina, which is down near the dock and drake. The other thing was there was one parcel of land where the gentleman decided, or the farmer decided, he was willing to sell the land, and that was no problem, but he wanted to reserve the oil and gas rights, and so they allowed him to retain the oil and gas rights. So somewhere down here, the oil and gas rights underneath the lake still belong to the heirs and assigns of that particular farmer. Don't know that that will ever happen, but that was what was one of the deeds, of the notable deeds. Okay, so now we move forward to the 1930s. Before we do that, let's do a little recap. In 1919, 1921, all of the Ohio land is acquired by the Pymatuning Land Company. And they announced that purchase of that land to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 1922. And so the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania now knows that they can build the dam. And the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania now has the problem of purchasing the land on the other side of where the lake is going to be in Pennsylvania. They had not started that process yet. 1929, Black Tuesday comes about, and we start into the Great Depression. And so that moves us forward to 1931, when finally all of the money needed to build the dam is approved, and the governor at that point in time, Governor Pinchot, comes out and breaks ground. There were 20,000 people who were in attendance at the groundbreaking in 1931. It's a large number of people. I have done reviews in newspapers.com, and There were newspaper articles as far west as St. Louis, as far east as Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, and all over there was talk about Pymatuning Lake. It was the largest man-made lake east of the Mississippi River during that time. So it was a big deal. So there were 20,000 who attended, and the next step, of course, was then the clearing of the land. And there's been a lot written about the clearing of the land that began in January of 1932, and it took until December of 1933, almost 2 full years, for all of that land to be cleared. You'll see in the pictures here that there looks like an army camp. In fact, these were National Guard tents from World War I that they used in 3 camps that were established around the area where the lake was being built. There were over 7,000 workers that were employed, most of them locally, and some came from other locations, to be able to clear the land for the lake. As I said, there were 3 work camps that were set up. 2 of them were set up south of what we know as the Causeway now, and 1 of them was a little bit north of the Causeway. As I say, National Guard provided all of the equipment. They provided kitchens. They provided all the electricity that was needed. They provided showers here for the workers. It was quite a sight for all of these workers who were here. In this picture, you see it looks like they're in white shirts. They actually had church services on Sundays, Sunday being rest day. They had that day off. They gathered, they played games, and they generally enjoyed themselves during the weekend. So they were well taken care of. They were well fed. During a period of time, there were some farm buildings that needed to be moved. And of course, there were a lot of trees that were down. You would think that perhaps those trees would have been used for logging and for lumber. They were not. It was too costly. There were too many varieties of trees to be able to do that. And so they literally burned all of those trees as they were taken down. There was one of the slogans that was used during that period of time was pick up and burn anything that might float. Obviously, when the lake fills with water, you didn't want to have a lot of stuff floating around on top of the lake. So it was either burned or it was picked up and it was piled up and moved away. There was an extremely high level of discipline in the camps. In fact, there was a colonel from the army who was in charge of everything. There was a large amount of discipline as a result of that. During that period of time, the Andover-Espyville Causeway was also built. And okay, here's a picture that you can see of the dam that was being put in. This is also a picture of part of the dam along where the dam is at, and the causeway between Andover and Espyville. Those were all part of the work that had to be done. So January 31st of 1934, the dam gates are closed. And there was a really, really bad spring. There was a lot of snow from the previous winter, and there was a lot of flooding that went on during that spring. But the gates were closed, and it stopped all that water from flowing downstream. So this was the first opportunity for the reservoir to show its benefits by preventing the flooding of the Shenandoah River. In January 3rd, 1935, the lake is declared filled, and they're ready to start business on the lake. It was deeded over to, during 1935, it was deeded over to the state of Ohio, the land that was on the Ohio side, to be used for recreational purposes. And I want to point out that there was no state park system until 1954 in Ohio. So even though the land was there for recreational purposes, there was no state park in place to manage that. So January, December 1935, I mentioned earlier that there was a deeding of rights for access to the lake. During 1935, those rights were deeded to those farmers who had property that adjoined the lake. There was a small strip of land that belonged to the state of Ohio before you get to the lake, but they had the rights to cross over that land and get to the lake. February 1936, the lake is declared filled, and also the Pennsylvania and Ohio signed what's called the Pymatuning Compact. Article 1, paragraph 10 of the Constitution of the United States, and I think it's a very short paragraph which talks about contracts between states. States are not allowed to enter into a contract for any purposes at all except in time of war. And if they do enter into a contract, it must be approved by the United States Congress and signed into law by the President. So they did come up with a compact, a contract between them that had to be put into law by the United States government, and that is called the Pymatuning Compact. June 11, 1936, the Pymatuning Land Company deeds the water rights to Pennsylvania. So here's the Pymatuning Land Company. They basically still own that land, which part of it has been deeded to Ohio. They deed the rest of it to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and with it, they deed the water rights. A lot of people always say, well, how come Ohio can't do anything about the level of the water that's in the lake? And the reason for that is because all of those water rights belong to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. There's only two points in time when that is not true. And if there's water needed down in the Mississippi River to float boats, then the Army Corps of Engineers comes in and directs the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to open the locks up so water can flow. The opposite of that is also true. If there's, okay, what did I just do? What did I just do? Opening the locks?
If the Mississippi needed the water, the opposite of that is?
Yeah, but what did I talk about first? Opening the locks for more water?
Yes.
Okay. So the opposite of that is also true. There may be a time when less water is needed, like when there's flooding down the Mississippi. During that period of time, the Army Corps of Engineers will come in and say, don't open the gates up, although there is a spillway, and at some point in time, the water will go over the spillway. July 1st, 1936, grand opening of the lake, and there were 80,000 people who were in this area in attendance at that grand opening of the lake. Made a comment, one of my earlier presentations about, I think if you had everybody standing and with their fingers touching each other and their arms outspread, they probably would have reached around the entire lake, and we'll talk about how long that is in a couple of minutes when we do the demographics. But I had an engineer who was in the audience, and he quickly pulled out his calculator, and when the presentation was over with, he says, you're right, giving some average for their span of their arms. If they all stood around the lake, they would have reached all the way around the lake. So it was a big deal, 80,000 people attending in 1936. So let's look at those demographics. The length of the lake is 17 miles. If you go from the dam and you stay in the center of the lake and up around the fish hook in the lake, then it's a total of 17 miles long. The maximum width at the Causeway, which is where the maximum width is at, it's about 1.6 miles across the lake. Some people say if you go up at the top and you go across, it's longer than that, but that's not staying in the center of the lake. The surface area is over 17,000 acres of the land that's underwater by the lake. The average depth is 15 feet of the lake, and again, that's an average. Obviously, along the shore, it's a lot less, and down at the dam, it's 35 feet deep. So that's the deepest point in the lake is down at the dam. Water volume, 64 billion with a B gallons of water that are in there when the water is at the point of going over the spillway and it's totally full. That's usually in the springtime. And there's the shore length, 70 miles. So if you took those 80,000 people and you stood them next to each other with their arms outstretched, they would reach 70 miles around that lake. Surface elevation is 10,012 feet, as we talked about earlier with our topographical map. And there are 7 islands. The compact between Ohio and Pennsylvania gives Pennsylvania the rights to those islands. That's considered part of the need to be able to control the water. So they have the rights to those islands. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Pymatuning Compact. Again, in Article 1, Section 10, Paragraph 3, is where we find the clause that prevents states from entering into a compact. That compact covers a lot of things. General use of the lake. Who can have boats on the lake? What size of boats? That kind of thing. Arrest and prosecution of offenders of any of the regulations that are on the lake. The islands, I talked about previously, those 7 islands, and who owns those 7 islands, and what can be done on those islands and what can't be done on the islands. The pollution of the water, there's clauses in there about the streams coming into the lake and how they are to be protected from pollution. There's also regulations on watercraft that's in there. We all know there's always a fight going on over how big of a motor can we put on the lake. And so motors and the regulation of motors, the licensing of boats, the licensing for other things such as fishing and hunting and that kind of thing are covered in that compact. The compact also covers not having water skis and things that are prohibited from being able to be on the lake. Fishing, the seasons for fishing, the licensing of fishing, the sizes of fish that can be caught are all part of that compact. Reciprocal hunting rights. And when we're talking about fishing and hunting rights, when you're on the lake, if you have an Ohio license or you have a Pennsylvania license, then you're okay. But if you're an Ohio resident and you go across the lake and you're standing on the shore of the other side and you throw out your fishing line or you pull out your gun to shoot a goose, you're in trouble because you're now on Pennsylvania land and you cannot do that. And as long as you're on the lake, either license in either state is allowed. There are wild game and fish sanctuaries that were established and they're talked about in the compact. And again, Pennsylvania has the right to the body of water and the control of that body of water. Changes to this compact are subject to the approval of the states and to the United States Congress and must be signed by the President of the United States. want to talk just a little bit about boating and motors, because that's always an issue. And someone came to the state park here recently and asked them what motors appeared on the lake at what points in time. And they came to me and asked me if I could find that, and I was able to go into newspapers.com and do some research. There has always been an ongoing conflict here between the naturalists and the boaters. The naturalists, of course, don't want large motors on the lake. They want it to remain natural, all of the wildlife that's here in the area. And then on the other side, you have the boaters. Certainly there are boaters who would like to be doing skiing and have ski-doos and those kinds of things out there. So those two sides have always been in conflict with each other. Okay, we're going to have to stop. I hit a button. I now have a totally different page up here.
Okay, let's stop.
So the opposite of that is also true. There may be a time when less water is needed, like when there's flooding down the Mississippi. During that period of time, the Army Corps of Engineers will come in and say, don't open the gates up. Although there is a spillway, and at some point in time, the water will go over the spillway. July 1st, 1936, grand opening of the lake, and there were 80,000 people who were in this area in attendance at that grand opening of the lake. Made a comment, one of my earlier presentations about, I think if you had everybody standing and with their fingers touching each other and their arms outspread, they probably would have reached around the entire lake. And we'll talk about how long that is in a couple of minutes when we do the demographics. But I had an engineer who was in the audience, and he quickly pulled out his calculator, and when the presentation was over with, he says, "You're right," giving some average for their span of their arms. If they all stood around the lake, they would have reached all the way around the lake. So it was a big deal, 80,000 people attending in 1936. So let's look at those demographics. The length of the lake is 17 miles. If you go from the dam and you stay in the center of the lake and up around the fish hook in the lake, then it's a total of 17 miles long. The maximum width at the Causeway, which is where the maximum width is at, it's about 1.6 miles across the lake. Some people say if you go up at the top and you go across, it's longer than that, but that's not staying in the center of the lake. The surface area is over 17,000 acres of the land that's underwater by the lake. The average depth is 15 feet of the lake, and again, that's an average. Obviously, along the shore, it's a lot less, and down at the dam, it's 35 feet deep. So that's the deepest point in the lake is down at the dam. Water volume, 64 billion with a B gallons of water that are in there when the water is at the point of going over the spillway and it's totally full. That's usually in the springtime. And there's the shore length, 70 miles. So if you took those 80,000 people and you stood them next to each other with their arms outstretched, they would reach 70 miles around that lake. Surface elevation is 10,012 feet, as we talked about earlier with our topographical map. And there are 7 islands. The compact between Ohio and Pennsylvania gives Pennsylvania the rights to those islands. That's considered part of the need to be able to control the water. So they have the rights to those islands. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Pymatuning Compact. Again, in Article 1, Section 10, Paragraph 3 is where we find the clause that prevents states from entering into a compact. That compact covers a lot of things. General use of the lake. Who can have boats on the lake? What size of boats? That kind of thing. Arrest and prosecution of offenders of any of the regulations that are on the lake. The islands, I talked about previously, those 7 islands, and who owns those 7 islands, and what can be done on those islands and what can't be done on the islands. The pollution of the water, there's clauses in there about the streams coming into the lake and how they are to be protected from pollution. There's also regulations on watercraft that's in there. We all know there's always a fight going on over how big of a motor can we put on the lake. And so motors and the regulation of motors, the licensing of boats, the licensing for other things such as fishing and hunting and that kind of thing are covered in that compact. The compact also covers not having water skis and things that are prohibited from being able to be on the lake. Fishing, the seasons for fishing, the licensing of fishing, the sizes of fish that can be caught are all part of that compact. Reciprocal hunting rights. And when we're talking about fishing and hunting rights, when you're on the lake, if you have an Ohio license or you have a Pennsylvania license, then you're okay. But if you're an Ohio resident and you go across the lake and you're standing on the shore of the other side and you throw out your fishing line or you pull out your gun to shoot a goose, you're in trouble because you're now on Pennsylvania land and you cannot do that. And as long as you're on the lake, either license in either state is allowed. There are wild game and fish sanctuaries that were established and they're talked about in the compact. And again, Pennsylvania has the right to the body of water and the control of that body of water. Changes to this compact are subject to the approval of the states and to the United States Congress and must be signed by the President of the United States. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about boating and motors. This is one of the issues that has always come up on this lake. There is a problem between the people who want all of the natural things, the wildlife, those kinds of things. They want it to be pristine in nature as a lake. And on the other side, you have the boaters. You have the recreationalists who want to have bigger engines and bigger motors on the lake. They want to be able to go out and ski and do those kinds of things. So there's always been a conflict between those. There were actually no motors, all rowboats. If you remember from 1936 when the lake opened until 1945. So 9 years went by before there were any motors that were allowed on the lake. And yes, there were motors back during that age. In July of 1945, President Harry Truman signed into law the use of a 6-horsepower motor up to the Causeway. So at that point in time, motors could only be used south of the Causeway. In August of 1961, President Kennedy then signed the 6-horsepower motor, which allowed it to go all the way to the dam. And so here we have another president. If you can imagine presidents signing into law the size of motors to be used on a lake, that's the kinds of things I guess presidents do. Typically you find this legislation attached to other bills that are going through. And so they're one of those things that get thrown in with a much, much larger bill that's getting signed. Okay, 1964, President Johnson, this is 3 years later, signed into law the 10-horsepower motor, which we used to call the 9.9 horsepower motor, and it was signed into law in 1964. And that pretty much stayed the same until 2008, when we had President Bush sign into law the 20-horsepower motor, which went all the way from the dam all the way up to where the ducks walk on the fish in Lyonsville. Okay, so that's a little bit about the lake, its history from back during the days when there was a glacier here, all the way up to the current day, at least the 2000s with the motors. I hope it gives you a better understanding of all of the things and the issues that were associated with the lake and the building of the lake. Again, not so much the actual building of the lake, but the issues that came in as a result of the farmers having their lands bought out, and that land then allowing access then to the lake became places where people had residential areas, and they have access to the lake through those residential areas. So that's pretty much an overview of the lake as I have seen it. It's been nice to have been with you, and I'm very happy to have made this presentation to you. Thank you.